Thank you very much. Before thanking, as I will, the organizers for the invitation, I want to thank Anita and Elizabeth for the very generous introduction, and to make a correction, I have no keynote speech to give. I take myself to be amongst friends and colleagues, and therefore I have a set of remarks that stem from the fact that when I received the invitation, I was in the process of drafting the report, had decided that archives was one of the contributions, one of the topics to which truth commissions indubitably can make a contribution, and therefore it was a sort of foregone conclusion that I would accept the invitation. There was a meeting organized by swisspeace precisely on this topic that produced materials that were very, very useful in the drafting of the report. So that also made it a foregone conclusion that I would be here. In any case, I appreciate immensely the invitation. It's perfectly timely from my standpoint. It's convened with the collaboration of the three countries that were the main sponsors of the resolution that created the mandate, and that also makes me very, very happy to be able to contribute, if not with a keynote speech, with some of the reflections that led me to think that this was an important topic to include in the report. So thanks, Elizabeth and Anita, for the introduction, and I am very grateful that the event was organized. So, precisely as I was saying, the side event coincides with the presentation of my report to the Council, this time on truth commissions. The report puts, among other issues, a focus on the question of archives, both national archives and archives of truth commissions, and tries to make some recommendations in this respect. The main recommendation is that there should be international standards developed for archives, and I am happy to say that, at least as one can tell from the interactive dialogue, that's an idea that seemed to be supported by many member states, and that I would like to carry forward. So the report, of course, you may have seen already. In these very brief remarks, I will want to focus on 3 points that I will hope will contribute to the discussion, and I will be very, very brief. First, as has been pointed out both by Elizabeth and by Anita, there is a need for more awareness raising on the importance of archives. The crucial importance of archives in dealing with the legacy of the past abuses has been reaffirmed on many occasions and by a significant number of policy commitments and statements. But I think that there is still a gap between those statements and actual practice. The Human Rights Council, for example, has characterized archives as key instruments in the realization of the right to truth. Archives are also closely linked to a victim's right to an effective remedy, arguably, and preserving them and providing access to archives will guarantee that the voices of victims will not be lost. Archives, of course, have also proven to be an important safeguard against revisionism and denial. And finally, the archives of truth commissions have played a role in supporting other transitional justice mechanisms, including prosecutions and reparations. Ambassador De Roto, in his very kind statement, the Human Rights Council yesterday made this point, particularly concerning the Argentinian case. But in spite of their significance in the fight against impunity, the preservation and access to truth archives has not received the required political, legal, and material support that the issue would deserve. This has led to great inconsistencies on the ground, with the consequence that victims are in some cases denied access to archives. Records in many cases are ill preserved and even lost. It's therefore important to continue to raise awareness at the national level as well as the international level on the importance of archives for the field of transitional justice and the promotion of human rights. And the side event today is one opportunity to work towards this end. The second point I want to make is that an elemental question that needs to be resolved, and this really reveals is the sort of incipient stage at which we are. One of the elemental questions that still needs to be resolved has to do with the disposition of archives. The decision concerning the repository of archives, of course, has very clear consequences, and is often the reason for lack of effective access to the records. In my report to the Council, I recommend that the following factors should be taken into consideration when making a decision on a possible repository. The first is the criterion of physical access. Transferring archives to faraway locations or abroad, as has happened in some cases, even if it is done in a host institution with a liberal access policy, puts non-digitalized sources out of reach for concerned populations. So there's a question about sheer physical distance. A second consideration that ought to be kept in mind has to do with preservation. Documents, even if they are in digital form, need to be preserved and not simply warehoused. I think that in the digital age we are getting used to the idea that we don't need to worry about preservation. But of course, I am sure that all of us have had the contrary and a very upsetting experience of not being able to access even our own electronic files. A perhaps more substantive and difficult factor that ought to be kept in mind has to do with the trustworthiness of the repository institution in the eyes of many different stakeholders, but particularly victims. Placing archives in institutions that are widely mistrusted by victims due, for example, to their past involvement in human rights violations, it generates very powerful disincentives for victims and others to seek access to the archives, and it raises concerns about the accuracy of the contained information, even if there is no obvious tampering. The third point, and the final point that I wanted to make in this brief introduction, is that the issue of access to archives deserves actually much more examination and work at many different levels. The overall objective should be to maximize access to archives to all stakeholders, but of course this raises some complicated questions about the compatibility of that open access with rights of privacy and personal security. So I want to mention two issues regarding this. The first is that in many countries where truth commissions and other transitional justice mechanisms operate, there are no pre-existing national archival laws. There is no legislation regulating data access and privacy matters. And of course, these are preconditions for the satisfactory resolution of potential conflicts between access, privacy, and security. But this is precisely one of the things that I think truth commissions can do regarding the topic of archives. Recommendations of truth commissions can give an important impetus to elaborate or change access laws and bring them in accordance with international human rights standards. I remember when I was working with the IER in Morocco, and I am very, very sorry that we do not get to hear about this case. Legislation concerning archives was practically non-existent. Physical archives were, and then documentation was incredibly dispersed and almost impossible to access. So one of the preconditions of questions about the disposition of the IER's own archives, of course, needed to resolve first a general legal framework. So this is indeed something that was done, and in the final report, the IER in Morocco made recommendations about the preservation and organization of and access to national archives, not just the IER's own documentation. Following those recommendations, an archive law was finally adopted in 2007, covering all records received and produced by the public service, including the Commission's own records. Many truth commissions could, however, do much better, and adopting the recommendations policies that maximize access to their archives. The second point regarding this is an effort to exemplify that there is absolutely no uniformity in the criteria for obtaining access to archives. On one end of the spectrum are the archives of the Comisión de Esclarecimiento Histórico de Guatemala, whose archives rest in the basement of the United Nations in New York, and accessing them requires specifically the written authorization signed by the Secretary General in person, and this is authorization to open a sealed container prior to 2015. At the opposite end of the spectrum lie the archives of the Commission of the Republic of Korea, which recommended that the record should be utilized in extensive scale to find more facts and to be studied as historical sources, and directed the repository to cooperate with all interested stakeholders. And of course, most commissions' archives lie somewhere in between those extremes. So to strike the right balance between accessibility and openness of archives on the one hand, and confidentiality and privacy on the other, is of course a tricky question. Difficulties exist, especially in those cases where security threats persist and data and document management infrastructures are weak. The case of the archives of the CABR in East Timor, for example, provides an illustration of some of the relevant security questions that need to be kept in mind. It's not a foregone conclusion that documents will be safe and that one doesn't need to worry about this issue. There are, however, technological advances in archiving which allow, for example, for the selected blocking of parts of documents, including names and other markers of individual identity, which facilitate making access compatible with privacy rights. The sharing of best practice, however, in this respect is important, and I think that this is an area in which much more work can be done, and not with great difficulty. So, in conclusion, against this background and the inconsistencies in practice, I have called in the report for the development of international standards on archiving. And of course, this is not an area where we need to start from scratch. OHCHR, for example, has made efforts to systematize existing standards in the area of access to information, protection and preservation of records, and the management of archives. Also, there are NGOs like swisspeace, precisely, that have been doing remarkable work on this topic. So I am extremely supportive of those initiatives, and whatever I can do to help based on the recommendations that I made in the report, I would be very, very happy to do. So, thank you very much.